Story 2 of The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 2, Rope's End, Part 2. Floréal took up his residence across the border. The countries had long been at war, so he found reason to change his name. He likewise changed his language, although that was not so easily accomplished, and then, since he had been born of the sea, he returned to it. But he could not bring himself to utterly forsake the island of his birth, for twice a year, when the seasons changed, when the trades died and the hot lands sent their odors reeking through the night, he felt a hungry yearning for Haiti. During these periods of lifeless heat his impulses ran wild. At these times his habits changed, and he became violent, nocturnal. As he thought of Petithomme Laguerre, he bit his wrists in an agony of recollection. Women shunned him. Men said to one another, "This Inocencio is a person of uncertain temper. He has a bad eye." "Whence did he come?" others inquired. "He's not one of us." "From Jamaica or the Barbados, perhaps. He has much evil in him." "Yet he makes no enemies." "Nor friends." A peculiar fellow, a man of passion. One can see it in his face." Haiti had become quiet once more, as quiet as could be expected, and the former colonel of tirailleurs had prospered. He was now General Petithomme Laguerre, commandant of the arrondissement of the South, and the echo of his name crept eastward along the coast, even to Azua. The bitterness of this news finally sent Inocencio seaward in a barkentine, the business of which was not above suspicion. He cruised through the Virgin Islands, on around the leewards and the windwards, seeing something of the world and tasting of its wickedness. A year later, at Trinidad, he fell in with a Portuguese half-breed, captain of a schooner bound on hazardous business, and inasmuch as high wages were promised, he shipped. Followed adventures of many sorts, during which Inocencio became a mate, but made no friends. One night, when the moon was full and the schooner lay becalmed, there was drinking and gambling in the little cabin. It was the change of the seasons, before the rains had come. The air was close, the ship reeked with odors. Inocencio played like a demon, for his heart was fierce and the cards befriended him. All night he and the Portuguese half-breed shuffled and dealt, drank rum, and cursed each other. When daylight came, the schooner had changed hands. Colon sits on the southern shore of the Caribbean, and through it drifts a current of traffic from many seas. It is like the riffle of a sluice or the catch-basin of a sewer, gathering all the sediment carried by the stream, and thither Captain Inocencio headed, drawn on the tide. It was at the time of the French fiasco, when de Lesseps' name was powerful, and when Cologne was the wickedest, sickest city of the Western Hemisphere. Into the harbor came Inocencio's schooner, pelting ahead of the stiff trade winds that blew like the draft from an electric fan, and there the Haytian stayed, for in Cologne he found work that suited him. There he heard the echo of tremendous undertakings, there he learned new rascalities, and met men from other lands who were homeless like himself. There he tasted of the white man's wickedness, and beheld forms of corruption that were strange to him. The nights were ribald and the days were drear, for fever stalked the streets, but Inocencio was immune, and for the first time he enjoyed himself. But he was solitary in his habits. The festering town, with its green-slimed sewers and its filthy streets, did not appeal to him, so he took up his abode on the shore of a little bay close behind, where a grove of palm trees overhung a sandy beach. Just across a mangrove swamp at his back was the city. Before him lay his schooner, her bowsprit pointed seaward. Day and night it pointed seaward like a resolute finger, pointed toward Haiti and Pierrine. In time the mulatto acquired a reputation and gathered a crew of ruffians over whom he tyrannized. There were women in his camp, too, Beaujon, Saint Lucien, and wenches from the other isles, but neither they nor their powdered sisters along the back streets of Cologne appealed to Inocencio very long, for sooner or later there always came to him the memory of a yellow girl with a scar beneath her eye, and thoughts of her brought pictures of a blue and gold negro colonel and an old man hanging by the wrists. Then it was that he felt a slow flame licking at his tendons, and his hatred blazed up so suddenly that the women fled from him, bearing marks of his fingers on their flesh. Sometimes he sailed away and was gone for weeks. When he returned, his crew told stories of aimless visits to the Haytian coast, in which there appeared to be neither reason nor profit, since they neither took nor fetched a cargo. These journeys came at regular intervals, as if there arrived upon the hurrying trades a call that took him northward just before the seasons changed. His helpers retailed other gossip also, rumors of a coming revolution in the Republic, tales of the great general Pédéon Laguerre, who had aims upon the presidency. Inocencio's ears were open, and what he heard stirred his rage. But he was not a brilliant man, and his brain, unused to strategy, refused to counsel him. For 5 years he had studied the matter incessantly, nursing his hate and searching for a means to satisfy it. Then, as if born of the lightning, he saw his way. He consulted a French clerk in the canal offices, and between them they contrived a letter which ran as follows: To His Excellency, General Pédéon Laguerre, Commandant of the Arrondissement of the South, Jacmel, Republic of Hayti. General, the bearer, Inocencio Ruiz of Cartagena, master of the schooner Stella, will consult you upon a matter of extreme delicacy which concerns the sale of 200 rifles. These arms, of latest model, were consigned to this port, but under the existing relations of amity between the French and Colombian governments they cannot be used. Knowing your patriotism and the zeal with which you safeguard the welfare of your country, the writer makes bold to offer these arms to you, as agent of the Haytian government, at a low figure. Captain Ruiz, a man of discretion, is empowered to discuss the matter with you at greater length. In full appreciation of your supreme qualities as a soldier and statesman, it is with admiration that I salute you. Respectfully, Antoine Leblanc. When the letter was finally read to Inocencio, he nodded, but the French clerk said doubtfully, "This Laguerre is a man of force, I believe. I should not care to trifle with him in this way." "I, too, am a man of force," said the mulatto. "He is your enemy?" "To the death." The white man shook his head. Danger lurks along the Haytian coast. Many things happen there, for the people are barbarians. I should prefer to forgive this Pédéon rather than oppose him, even though he were my enemy. Inocencio scowled. "When I die, I shall have no enemies to forgive, for I shall have killed them all," he said simply. Jacmel lay white in the blazing sun as the Stella dropped anchor. The trades were failing, and the schooner drifted slowly under a full spread of canvas. Near where she came to rest lay a Haytian gunboat, ill-painted, ill-manned, ill-disciplined, and Inocencio regarded her with some concern, for her presence was a thing he had not counted upon. It argued either that Laguerre had won the support of her commander, or that she had been sent by the government as a check upon his activities. In either event, she was a menace. A band was playing in the square, and there were many soldiers. Inocencio did not go ashore. Instead, he sent the letter by a member of his crew, a giant Bahan whom he trusted, and with it he sent word that he hoped to meet His Excellency, General Laguerre, that evening at a certain drinking place near the waterfront. The sailor returned at dusk, with news that set his captain's eyes aglow. Jacmel was alive with troops. There had been a review that very afternoon, and the populace had hailed the commandant as president. On all sides there was talk of revolution. The whole south country had enrolled beneath the banner of revolt. The gunboat was Laguerre's. All Hayti craved a change. The old familiar race cry had been raised, and the mulattoes were in terror of another massacre. But the regular troops were badly armed, and the perusal of Inocencio's letter had filled the general with joy. Captain Ruiz was early at the meeting place, but he waited patiently, drinking rum and listening to the chatter of the street. His Spanish accent, his identity as the master of the schooner in the offing, and, above all, his threatening eyes, won him a tolerance which the warlike blacks did not accord to Haytians of his color. Therefore he was not molested. He soon confirmed his sailor's story. Revolution was indeed in the air. The country was seething with unrest. Many houses already had been burned, sure token of an uprising. The soldiers had had a taste of pillage and persecution. The streets were thronged with them now. Merchants were on guard before their shops. From every side came the sounds of revelry and quarreling. Laguerre arrived, finally, a huge, forbidding man of martial bearing, and he was heralded by cheers. He was much older and infinitely prouder than when Inocencio had seen him. His uniform had been blue at that time, but now it was parrot green. His epaulets were broader, the gold braid and the dangling loops were heavier, and he was fat from easy living. With age and power he had coarsened, but his eyes were still bloodshot and domineering. "Captain Ruiz?" he inquired, pausing before the yellow man. "Your Excellency!" Inocencio rose and saluted. The seaman's eyes were smoldering, but his lips were cold, for he felt the dread of recognition. Time, it seemed, had dulled the sharp outlines of Laguerre's memory, as it had changed the younger man's features, for he continued unsuspectingly, "You are the agent of Monsieur Leblanc, I believe." "The same." "Good. Now, these rifles, you have them near by?" "Within gunshot, Excellency. They are in the harbor at this moment." Laguerre's face lighted. "Ah, a man of business, this Leblanc. You will fix the price, as I understand it." There followed a certain amount of bickering, during which the general allowed himself to be worsted. He agreed weakly to Inocencio's terms, having already decided to appropriate the God-sent cargo without payment. The latter had counted upon this, and, moreover, he had rightfully construed the light in those bloodshot eyes. "Monsieur le Général must see these rifles for himself, to appreciate them, and he must count them, too, else how can he know that I am not deceiving him? We must observe caution, for there may be spies." Inocencio spoke craftily. "Pah! Spies, Jacmel? Nevertheless, there is a gunboat in the harbor, and she flies the flag of the Republic. My skiff is waiting. We will slip out and back again. In an hour the inspection will be completed. You must see those rifles with your own eyes, Excellency. They are wonderful, the equal of any in the world. No troops can stand before them. They are magnificent." "Oh, come," said Laguerre, rising. "But alone?" Inocencio displayed a worthy circumspection. "This is hazardous business. That warship with the flag of the Republic. My employer is a man of reputation." "Very well." Laguerre dismissed an aide who had remained at a distance during the interview, and together the two set out. "You arrived barely in time, for we march to morrow," said the general. "At least we march within the week. My defiance has gone forth. My country cries for her defender. There will be bloody doings, for I tell you the temper of the people is roused, and they have no stomach for that tyrant at Port-au-Prince." "Bloody doings!" Inocencio smiled admiringly upon his companion. "And who could cope with them better than yourself? You have a reputation, Excellency. The name of Petithomme Laguerre is known, even in my country." "Indeed?" The black general's chest swelled. "We have heroes of our own, men who have bathed in blood defending our rights, but our soldiers are only soldiers, they are not statesmen. We are not so fortunate as Hayti. We would welcome, we would idolize such a one. Would that we had him! Would that we boasted a Petithomme Laguerre!" The hearer was immensely gratified at this flattery, and he straightened himself pompously, saying, "But we are favored by God, we Haytians, and we have bred a race of giants. We have gained our proud position among the nations at the price of blood. Believe me, we are not ordinary men. Our soldiers are braver than lions. Our armies are the admiration of the world. We have reached that level for which God created us. It requires strong hands to guide such a people. My country calls. I am her servant." The moon was round and brilliant as they walked out upon the rotting wharf. All wharves in Hayti are decayed. The night had grown still, and through it came the gentle whisper of the tide, mingled with the babble from the town. Landowners combined with the pungent stench of the harbor in a scent which caused Inocencio's nostrils to quiver and memory to gnaw at him. He cast a worried look skyward, and in his ungodly soul prayed for wind, for a breeze, for a gentle zephyr which would put his vengeance in his hands. He had dropped anchor well offshore, hence the row was long, but as they neared the Stella a breath came out of the open. It was hot, stifling, as if a furnace door had opened, and the yellow man smiled grimly into the night. The crew were sleeping on the deck as the two came overside, but at sight of that glittering apparition of green and gold they rubbed their eyes open and stared in speechless amazement. They were reckless fellows, fit for any enterprise, but Inocencio had learned to keep a silent tongue, so they knew nothing of his present plans. They heard him saying, "Into the cabin, Monsieur le Général, if you will be so good. It is dark, yes, but there will be light presently. And then a sight for any soldier's eyes, something that will gladden the heart of any patriot." They went below, leaving the sailors open-mouthed. "A miserable place, Excellency," came the soft voice, "but the cause. For Hayti one would suffer. A match, if you will be so kind. The lamp is at your hand." The skylight glowed a faint yellow, then was brightly illuminated. "For Hayti one would endure much." There followed the sound of a blow, of a heavy fall, then a loud, ferocious cry, and a subdued scuffling, during which the crew stared at one another. The giant Bayam crept forward finally, and was met by Inocencio emerging from the cabin. The captain was smiling, and he carefully closed the hatch before he gave orders to make sail. The breeze was faint, so the schooner gathered headway slowly, but as the lights of Jacmel and of the anchored gunboat faded out astern, Inocencio sat upon the deck-house and drummed with his naked heels upon the cabin wall. He lit one cigarette after another, and the helmsman saw that he was laughing silently. Dawn broke in an explosion of many colors. The sun rushed up out of the sea as if pursued. Night fled, and in its place was a blistering day, full grown. The breeze had died, however, and the Stella wallowed in a glassy calm, her sails slatting, her booms creaking, her gear complaining to the drunken roll. The slow swells heeled her first to one side, then to the other. The decks grew burning hot. No faintest ripple stirred the undulating surface of the Caribbean. Afar, the Haytian hills wavered and danced through a veil of heat. The slender topmast described long, measured arcs across the sky, like a schoolmaster's pointer. From its peak the halyards whipped and bellied. "Captain!" The Bayan waited for recognition. "Captain!" Inocencio looked up finally. "There, beyond Jacmel, there is smoke. See! We have been watching it." The mulatto nodded. "The smoke of a ship." "Ah, a ship!" Inocencio smiled, and the negro recoiled suddenly. All night long the master of the Stella had sat upon the deck-house, staring at the sea and smoking. At times he had laughed and whispered to some one whom the helmsman could not see, but this was the first time he had smiled at any member of his crew. In fact, it was the first time the sailor had ever seen him smile. The Bayan withdrew and went forward to consult with his fellows. They eyed their employer curiously, fearfully, for much had happened to alarm them, not the least of which had been a furious commotion from below. Frightful curses had issued from the cabin, threats which had caused their limbs to tremble, but they had affected the captain like soothing music. It was very strange. It caused the sailors to look with concern upon that thin, low streamer in the distance. It led them to go aft in a body finally and speak their minds. "The smoke is growing larger," they declared, and Inocencio roused himself sufficiently to look. "It is the warship. We are pursued. Who is this big man below?" "He is a friend of mine, Petithomme Laguerre." "Laguerre? What did I tell you?" exclaimed the 'Bajan breathlessly. "What shall we do?" one of them inquired in a panic. "That smoke! The wind has forsaken us." He shuffled his bare feet uncomfortably. "We will be shot for this." Inocencio tossed away his cigarette and rose. He lifted his eyes aloft. The slim topmast arrested his attention as it swept across the sky, and he watched it for a moment. Then to the giant sailor he said, "You will find a new rope forward. Make it fast to the end of this halyard and run it through yonder block." He slid back the hatch and descended leisurely into the cabin. Laguerre was sitting in a chair with his arms and legs securely bound, but he had succeeded in working considerable havoc with the furnishings of the place as well as with his splendid uniform. His lips foamed, his eyes protruded at sight of his captor. A trickle of blood from his scalp lent him a ferocious appearance. Inocencio seated himself, and the two men stared at each other across the bare table. Laguerre spoke first, his tongue thick, his voice hoarse from yelling. Inocencio listened with fixed, unwavering gaze. "You tricked me neatly," the former raved. "You are a government spy, I presume. The government feared me. Well, then, it was bold work, but you will listen to what I say now. We will settle this matter quickly, you and I. I have money. You can name your price." The hearer curled his thin lips. "So you have money. You offer to buy your life. Old Julien had no money. He was poor." Petithomme did not understand. "I am too powerful to remain in prison," he declared. "The president would not dare harm me. No man dares harm me, but I am willing to pay you. All Haiti could not buy your life, Laguerre." Some tone of voice, some haunting familiarity of feature set the prisoner's memory to groping blindly. At last he inquired, "Who are you?" "I am Floréal." The name meant nothing. Laguerre's life was black. Many Floréals had figured in it. "You do not remember me." "No, and yet perhaps you will remember another, a woman. She had a scar just here." The speaker laid a tobacco-stained finger upon his left cheekbone, and Laguerre noticed for the first time that the wrist beneath it was maimed as from a burn. It was a little scar, and it was brown in the candlelight. She was young and round, and her body was soft. The mulatto's lean face was suddenly distorted in a horrible grimace, which he intended for a smile. "She was my wife, Laguerre, by the church, and you took her. She died, but she had a child, your child." The huge black figure shrank into its green and gold panoply. The bloodshot eyes rested upon Inocencio with a look of terrified recognition. "I have no children, Laguerre, no wife, no home. I am poor, and you have become great. There was an old man whom you stretched by the wrists in the moonlight. Do you remember him? And the old woman, my mother, whom one of your soldiers shot? Maximilian did it, but I killed him, and Congo. And now there is only you." "That was long ago." The prisoner rolled his eyes desperately. His voice was uncertain as he whined, "I am rich, richer than anybody knows." "Others had more money than we, eh?" The general nodded. "Perrien is dead, and you would have been the president. It is well that I came in time." Again Captain Ruiz smiled, and the corpulent soldier was shaken loosely, as by an invisible hand. "Come now, your friends are approaching, and I must prepare you to greet them." He untied the knots at Laguerre's ankles, then motioned him toward the cabin door. That streamer of smoke had grown. It was a black smudge against the sky when the two gained the deck, and at sight of it the general shouted, "My ship, the gunboat! Oh, if harm comes to me—" Inocencio took one end of the new rope which had been run through the block at the masthead and knotted it about his prisoner's wrists. Then, with his knife, he severed the other bonds. "Give way," he ordered. The crew held back, at which he turned upon them so savagely that they hastened to obey. They put their weight upon the line. Laguerre's arms were whisked above his head. He felt his feet leave the deck. He was dumb with surprise, choked with rage at this indignity, but he did not understand its significance. "Up with him, in a rush!" cried the captain, and hand over hand the sailors hauled in, while upward in a series of jerks went Petithomme Laguerre. The schooner listed, and he swayed outward. He tried to entwine his legs in the shrouds, but failed, and he continued to rise until his feet had cleared the crosstree. "Make fast," Inocencio ordered. Laguerre was hanging like a huge plumb bob now, and as the schooner heeled to starboard he swung out farther and farther, until there was nothing beneath him but the glassy sea. He screamed at this, and kicked and capered. The slender topmast sprung to his antics. Then the vessel righted herself, and as she did so, the man at the rope's end began a swift and fearful journey. Not until that instant did his fate become apparent to him. But when he saw what was in store for him, he ceased to cry out. He fixed his eyes upon the mast toward which the weight of his body propelled him. He drew himself upward by his arms. He flung out his legs to break the impact. The Stella lifted by the bow, and he cleared the spar by a few inches. Onward he rushed to the pause that marked the limit of his flight to port. Then slowly, but with increasing swiftness, he began his return journey. Again he resisted furiously, and again his body missed the mast, all but one shoulder, which brushed lightly in passing and served to spin him like a top. The measured slowness of that oscillation added to its horror. With every escape the victim's strength decreased, his fear grew, and the end approached. It was a game of chance played by the hand of the sea. Under him the deck appeared and disappeared at regular intervals. The rope cut into his wrists. The slim spar sprung to his efforts. In the distance was a charcoal smear, which grew blacker. After a time Laguerre heard Inocencio counting, and saw his upturned face. "Ah, very close, Monsieur le Général, but we will try once again. Ship's timber is not so hard as Cocomacaque, but sufficiently hard, nevertheless. And the rope bites, eh? But there was old Julien. What, again? You are always lucky. His flesh was cold and his bones brittle, yet he did not kick like you. If Peregrine were here to see this, what a sight! The liberator of his country. God's blood, Laguerre, the sea is with you. That makes 5 times. But you are tiring, I see. What a sight for her, the hero of 100 battles, dangling like a strangled parrot. It is not so hard to die, monsieur. A cry of horror arose from the crew, who had gathered forward, for Petithomme Laguerre, dizzied with spinning, had finally fetched up with a crash against the mast. He ricocheted. The swing of the pendulum became irregular for a time or two, then the roll of the vessel set it going again. Time after time he missed destruction by a hair's breadth, while the voice from below gibed at him. Then once more there came the sound of a blow, dull yet loud, and of a character to make the hearers shudder. The victim struggled less violently. He no longer drew his weight upward like a gymnast, but he was a man of great vitality. His bones were heavy and thickly padded with flesh. Therefore they broke one by one, and death came to him slowly. The sea played with him maliciously, saving him repeatedly, only to thresh him the harder when it had tired of its sport. It was a long time before the restless Caribbean had reduced him to pulp, a spineless, boneless thing of putty, which danced to the spring of the resilient spruce. They let him down finally and slid him into the oily water overside, but the breeze refused to come, and the Stella continued to wallow drunkenly. The sky was glittering, the pitch was oozing from the deck. In the distance the Haytian mountains scowled through the shimmer. Inocencio turned toward the approaching gunboat, which was very close by now, a rusty, ill-painted, ill-manned tub. Her blunt nose broke the swells into foam. From her peak depended the banner of the Black Republic, symbolic of the motto, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." The captain of the Stella rolled and lit a cigarette, then seated himself upon the cabin roof to wait. And as he waited he drummed with his naked heels and smiled, for he was satisfied. End of Story 2, Part 2. Story 3 of The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 3, Inocencio, Part 1. Captain Inocencio prepared to let himself over the side of the schooner. Outside, the Caribbean was all agleam, save where the coral reef teeth gnashed it into foam. Inside, a sand beach, yellow in the moonlight, curved east and west like a causeway until the distance swallowed it. Back of that lay the groves of cocoanut trees, their plumes waving in the undying undulations that had never ceased since first the trade winds breathed upon them. Beneath the palms themselves the jungle was ink-black, patched here and there with silver. The air was heavy with the slow rumble of an ever-restless surf, and all about the sea was whispering, as if minded to tell its mysteries to the moon, not yet 2 hours high. It was the sort of night that had ever awakened wild impulses in Captain Inocencio's breast. It was on such a night that he had first felt the touch of a woman's lips. It was on such another night that he had first felt a man's warm blood upon his hands. That had been long ago, to be sure, in far Haiti, and since that time both of those sensations had lost much of their novelty, for he had lived fast and hard, and his exile had plunged him into many evils. It was on such a night also that he had begun his wanderings, fleeing southward between moonrise and moonset. Southward, whither all the scum of the Indies floated. But even to this day, when the full of a February moon came round with the fragrant salt trades blowing and the sound of a throbbing surf beneath it, the sated, stagnant blood of Captain Inocencio went hot, his thin mulatto face grew hard, and a certain strange exultance blazed within him. His crew had long since come to recognize this frenzy, and had they now beheld him, poised half-nude at the rail, his fierce eyes bent upon the forbidden shore, they would have ventured no remark. As it happened, however, they were all asleep, all three of them, and the captain's lip curled scornfully. What could black men know about such subtleties as the call of moonlight? What odds to them if yonder palm fronds beckoned? They had no curiosity, no resentfulness; otherwise they too might have dared to break the sandblast law. It was 4 years now since he had begun to sail this coast, and even though he was known on every quay and bay from Nombre de Dios to Tiburon, and even though it was recognized that the Señor Bill Williams paid proper price for cocoa and ivory nuts, his head trader had never beaten down the people's distrust. On the contrary, their vigilance had increased, if anything, and now, after 4 years of scrupulous fair dealing, he, Captain Inocencio, was still compelled to sleep offshore and under guard, like any common stranger. It had made the Haytian laugh at first, for who would wish to harm a San Blas woman with the streets of Colon but 100 miles to the west? Then, as the months crept into years, and for voyage after voyage he never saw a San Blas woman's face, he became furious. Next he grew angry, then sullen, and a sense of injury burned into him. He set his wits against theirs, but invariably the sight of his schooner's sails was a signal for the women to melt away. Invariably, when night came and he and his blacks had been herded back aboard their craft, the women returned, and the sound of their voices served to fan the flame within his breast. Night after night, in sheltered coves or open river mouths, the captain of the Espirita had lain belly down upon the little roof of the deck house, his head raised serpent-wise, his gloomy eyes fixed upon the cook fires in the distance. And when some woman's figure suddenly stood out against the firelit walls, or when some maiden's song came floating seaward, he had breathed curses in his bastard French and directed a message of hate at the sentinel he knew was posted in the jungle shadows. At times he had railed at his crew of spiritless Jamaican niggers, and lusted for a following of his own kind, men with the French blood of his island in their veins, men who would follow where the moonlight flickered. He had even gone so far at one time as to search the waterfronts from Port Limon to Santa Marta in quest of such fellows. He had winnowed the offscourings of the four seas gathered there, but without success. They were villainous chaps for the main part, crossed with many creeds and colors, and ready for any desperate venture. But he could not find three helpers of sufficient hardihood to tamper with the San Blas virgins. Instead, they had retold him the tales he already knew by heart, tales of swift and sudden retribution overtaking blacks and whites, retribution that did not halt even at the French or the hated Americanos. They told him that of all the motley races gathered here since earliest Spanish days, the San Blas blood alone retained its purity. It was his boss, the Señor Williams, who had gone back farthest into history, and it was he likewise who had threatened him with prompt discharge if he presumed to trespass. The Señor Williams was not one to permit profitable trade relations to be jeopardized by the whim of a Haytian mulatto. Inocencio had listened passively, then, when alone, smiled. He owed no loyalty. He had no law. Even the name he went by was a fiction. He continued to make his trips, and when he came driving in ahead of the humming trade winds, his schooner laden with the treasures of the islands, the back streets of Colon awoke to his presence and prepared to greet him. But however loud the music in the cantinas, however fierce the exultation of the liquor in him, however wild the orgy into which he plunged, he could never quite drown the memory of those sleepless vigils far to the eastward. Ever in his quiet moments he heard the faint song of San Blas women, wafted by the breath of the sea. Ever in his dreams he saw the slim outlines of girlish figures black against a flaring campfire. 4 years this thing had grown upon him, during which he had haunted the San Blas coast, and then one night he slipped overside and swam ashore. It was not so dangerous as it seemed, for once he had gained the shelter of the jungle, no less than a pack of hounds could have followed him, inasmuch as the thickets were laced by a network of trails that gave forth no sound to naked souls, and the rustling branches overhead, played upon by the never-ceasing breeze, drowned all signal of his presence. Once he had defied the tribal law, he knew no further peace. It was like the first taste of blood to an animal. Thereafter Inocencio, the outlaw, whose name was a symbol of daring, became a jackal prowling through the midnight glades, tasting the scent of the villages, and staring with hungry eyes from just beyond the shadow's edge. Rather, he became a panther, for in his caution was no cowardice, only a feline patience. Village after village he hunted, until he had marked his prey. Then he waited to spring. To be sure, he had never spoken with the girl, nor even seen her clearly, but the sound of her voice made him tremble. To accomplish even this much had taken many trips of the Espirita, had meant many sleepless nights, and some few tense moments when only the shadows saved him from betrayal. There had been times, for instance, when the quick simulation of a wild pig's grunt, or the purr of El Tigre, had served to explain the sound of his retreat. Other times, when he had stood motionless in the shadows, the evil rust-red blade of his machete matching the hue of his half-nude body. Tonight he crouched behind the deck-house and ran his eyes over the schooner in one final glance of caution. It was well that all should be in readiness, for the moment of his springing might come within the hour, or if not tonight, then tomorrow night, or a week, a month, a year from tonight, and then a tackle fouled or a block jammed might spell destruction. He thrust his head through a loop of the leathern scabbard and swung the huge knife back until it lay behind the crease between his shoulders. Then he seized the port stay and let himself softly downward overside. The water rose to his chin. Without a ripple he glided into the moonlight astern, and a moment later his round black head was no more than a piece of bobbing drift borne landward by the current. Down past the village he swam, noting the rows of dugouts on the beach. He saw a blot in the big mahogany cayuca, a great canoe hewn from one priceless trunk, and recognized it for the sentinel. On he floated, then worked his way ashore behind the little point. Once he felt the hard, smooth sand beneath his soles, he waited until a cloud obscured the moon, and when the light broke through again he was dripping underneath a wide-leaved breadfruit tree at the jungle's edge. Removing the machete from his neck, he wrung the water from his cotton trousers. Over his head a night-bird croaked hoarsely. The girl was at her father's house, tending a fire on the dirt floor. It was a large house, for the old man was rich in daughters, and by the San Blas rule their husbands had come to live with him. He had waxed fat long ago on their labors, and now only his youngest one remained unmarried. But the ceremony was set. Inocencio had heard the news upon his arrival 3 days before, and had grudgingly bought a big store of tortoise-shell from the groom-to-be, knowing full well that the money was intended for the wedding celebration. Marquinha was the fellow's name, a straight, upstanding youth who more than once had excited the Haytian's admiration for his skill with a canoe. But since that day the latter had regarded him with smoldering eyes. The big thatched roof, with its bark-floored loft, stood on posts blackened by the smoke of many feasts. There were no walls. The jungle crept close to it from the rear, and hence the watcher could witness every movement of the girl as she passed between the hammocks or stooped to her task. He could see, for instance, the play of her dark, round shoulders above the neck of her shift. He ground his yellow teeth and gripped the moist earth with the soles of his naked feet, as a tiger bears its claws before the leap. It was very hard to wait. For an hour he stood there. Once a dog came to him and sniffed, then, recognizing a frequent visitor, returned to the house and resumed its slumber beside the fire. From the houses beyond came the sound of voices, of a child crying querulously, and of a woman quieting it. People came and went. An old hag began pounding grain in a mortar, crooning in a broken voice. The girl's father came rolling into view, and after a word to her, struggled heavily up the ladder to his bed. He was snoring almost before the structure had ceased to creak beneath him. In the thicket a multitude of nocturnal sounds arose, the insect chorus of the night. And then, before Inocencio realized what she was up to, the girl had stolen swiftly out and past him, so close that he could hear the scruff of her sandals on the beaten path. The next instant he had glided from cover and fallen in behind, his pulses leaping, his long, lithe muscles rippling, but he moved as silently as a shadow. Had he been a less accomplished bushman, he might have lost her, for she plunged into the jungle unhesitatingly. However, he had long ago learned these trails by daylight, and knew them better than the lines of his own palm. Hence, every moonlit turn, every flash of her white slip, found him close upon her track. It puzzled him at first to discover her reason for this unexpected sally, but soon he decided she must be bent upon some mission. Then, when he saw that she purposely avoided the village and was bending toward the open palm grove abreast of his anchorage, he knew she must be going to a tryst. So Marquinha was the sentinel. That fellow in the mahogany cayuca was her lover. Inocencio, the dissolute, felt a flame of rage suffuse him. When at last his quarry emerged into the mysterious half-light under the high roof of palms and paused, he strode after her. She gave the melancholy call of the night bird that had sounded in the breadfruit tree over his head earlier in the evening; then, seeing him close beside her, uttered a little cry of pleasure. Not until he was too near for flight did she discover her mistake, and then she seemed to freeze. Her utter silence was more menacing than a scream. It was the instant for which he had schooled himself, so he spoke to her in her own tongue. "Make no outcry. I will not harm you." She drew back, at which he laid his great bony hand upon her, his eyes blazing. She was deathly frightened, being little more than a child. "I have waited for you many nights," he explained. "I feared you would never come." Then, as she continued to stare up at him uncomprehendingly, he ran on. "I am Inocencio, the traitor. Every night I have watched you at your work. I want you for my woman." Her voice had forsaken her utterly, but she struggled weakly, so he tightened his grip until his fingers sank into her flesh. She began to gasp as if from a swift run. The open neck of her garment slipped down over one shoulder. Her eyes were distended until he saw them ringed about with white. The terror of this tall, yellow man with the hungry eyes robbed her of power, and she let him drag her toward the lapping water, as if she were no more than some weak, wild thing that he had trapped. Of course she knew him, for while the San Blas law may banish women, it cannot blind them, and she too had studied him from concealment. Although his words had made no impression whatever upon her, his grasp and the direction he was drawing her had at last translated what was in his mind. Then she burst into life, but she made no outcry, for it takes strength to scream, and every atom of her force was directed against his. She began to moan. Her every muscle writhed. With her free hand she tore at his entwining fingers, but they were like jungle creepers that no human strength could serve to loosen. And all the time he drew her with him, speaking softly. Then she felt him pause, and her distracted vision beheld another figure entering the shadows from the shore. She called to her lover hoarsely, and saw him halt at the strange note, peering inward for a sight of her. She voiced words now, for the first time, crying, "The stranger! The stranger!" Then, hearing the scrape of her captor's machete as he drew it from its scabbard, she renewed her struggle more fiercely. Captain Inocencio held the girl at his left side until the last moment, balancing the great knife blade as if to try his arm. Then, when the Indian was close upon him, coming straight as a dart, he freed himself. A slanting moonbeam showed Marquinhos' ferocious visage and his upraised weapon, but the Haytian met the falling blow with a fierce upward stroke that once before had done him service. It was the stroke that had made him an exile years before. Inocencio's physical strength had ever been his pride, if also his undoing. Above all things he prided himself upon the dexterity and vigor of his wrist. His early training on that blood-red Caribbean isle, and a later life in thicket and swamp, had served to transform the cumbrous native weapon into a thing of life at his hands. More than once, for instance, he had harried a serpent until it struck, for the mere satisfaction of severing its head in mid-course, and now he felt the wide blade enter flesh. Before his antagonist could cry out twice, he had slashed again, this time downward, as if to split a green cocoanut. The next instant he had seized the girl as she fled into the jungle. But she had found her voice at last, and he was forced to muffle her with his palm. When they were out into the moonlight, however, with the dry sand up to their ankles, he let her breathe. Then, pointing with his machete to the Espirita lying white and ghost-like in the offing, he drove her down into the warm sea until it reached her waist. "Swim," he ordered, and when she would have renewed the alarm, he raised his blade, grimly threatening to call the sharks with her blood. "Swim," he repeated, and she struck out, with him at her shoulder. But the village was roused. A confused clamor betrayed its bewilderment, and before the swimmers had won more than halfway to the schooner, figures came running along the shore. Inocencio cautioned the girl to hold her tongue, and she obeyed, thoroughly cowed by his roughness. She turned upon her side and swam with her face close to his, her eyes fixed upon him curiously, wonderingly. Her easy progress through the water showed that her fright had largely vanished, and showed likewise that, had the Haytian been no common swimmer himself, she might have distanced him. All the way out to the boat she stared at him with that same fixed look, maintaining her position at his side. The moon and the salt brine in his eyes played him tricks, else he might have fancied her to be half smiling, as if in some strange exaltation akin to his own. Not until he finally dragged her, panting, to the deck of the Espirita, and her white-clad figure stood out clearly from the shore, did her tribesmen realize the nature of the alarm. Then the vibrant turmoil suddenly stilled for the space of a full minute, while the enormity of the outrage made itself felt. They drew together at the edge of the sea, staring open-mouthed, amazed, before they raised their blood cry. The man and woman rested a moment, their eyes upon the shore, and where they stood twin pools of water blackened the deck. Then Inocencio turned to look upon his prey. The girl's flimsy cotton shift was molded to her figure, and he saw that she was even fairer than he had pictured. In spite of his need for haste, he paused to gloat about the favor the moon and the salt sea had rendered him. As for her, she flung his glance back bravely until he wrenched open the cabin hatch and pointed to the dark interior. Then she weakened, but she had a will of her own, it seemed, for she refused to be locked inside. He strode toward her, and she clutched the rigging desperately, turning her glance to one of appeal. "You may come up in a moment," he translated, but still she clung to the stay. "If you try to escape—" He scowled upon her terribly, at which she shook her head. Having already tasted her strength, he knew that there was no time to force her, so he leaped at his crew. The three blacks were snoring forward of the deck-house, so he seized a bucket of water at the rail and sluiced them into wakefulness, keeping his eye upon the girl meanwhile. When he saw that in truth she made no move, he let his caution slip and raged over the ship like a tiger, beating his half-clad crew ahead of him with the flat of his machete. By the time they had gained their wits, the tribesmen were massing at the canoes. As the mainsail rose creaking, he broke out the jib with his own hand, then with one stroke of his knife severed the manila mooring rope, and the Espirita fell off slowly ahead of the breeze. Inocencio ran back to spur his befuddled niggers to further activity, only to find the girl still motionless, her eyes following his every movement. Under the curses, the schooner slowly raised her wings, and the night wind began to strain at the cordage. But at last, when the Jamaicans were fully awake to the state of affairs, they threatened mutiny, whereat the mulatto flung himself upon them so savagely that they scattered to arm themselves with whatever weapons lay at hand. Then they huddled amidship, rolling their eyes and praying, for out from the shore came a long mahogany cayuca, and it was full of straight-haired men. It takes a sailing craft some time to gain its momentum, and as yet the full strength of the trades had not struck the Espirita. Hence the canoe overtook her rapidly. Inocencio called to one of his men and gave him the tiller, then took stand beside the girl, the naked blade of his weapon once more beneath his arm. The schooner's helmsman gave himself to God, while the cordage overhead began to whine as the deck rose. It was upon the Haytian's lips to warn his pursuers off, when one of them called to the girl, bidding her leap. Inocencio heard the breath catch in her throat, but she made no move, and the command was repeated. This time she answered by some exclamation that he did not understand, whereat the canoemen ceased paddling, as if her word had paralyzed them. They hurled their voices at her savagely, but she remained motionless, the while the waters beneath her began to foam and bubble. The Espirita's crew ceased their prayers, and in the silence that ensued the sea whispered at the bow as the craft listed more heavily under the full force of the wind. Inocencio could not fathom the meaning of the subdued colloquy among the San Blas men, so he shouted a warning, but strangely enough they made no answer. They only crouched with paddles motionless, staring at the dimming figures facing them, until the Espirita, wing and wing ahead of the trades, was no larger than a seagull. As yet they had not learned of the other tragedy hidden in the shadow of the palms. Had they suspected what lay weltering at the edge of a trampled, moonlit glade behind them, no threat of Inocencio's, no plea of his new-found woman could have held them back. Once the schooner was under way, the Haytian led the girl to the deck-house and thrust her roughly inside, closing the hatch. Then with his own hands he took his craft through the reef and out into the leaping Caribbean. Not until the San Blas coast was a mere charcoal line upon the port quarter, and the salt spray was driving high, did he deliver over the helm. At last, however, he gave his crew instructions for the night and went below, closing and bolting the hatch behind him. When the smoky lamp that swung between the bunks was lit, and its yellow gleam had illumined the interior, he saw the girl's eyes fast upon him. He went toward her across the tilting floor, and she arose to meet him, smiling. End of Story 3, Part 1. Story 3 of the Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 3, Inocencio, Part 2. Señor Bill Williams was in a fine rage. "Didn't you like your job?" he questioned. Inocencio shrugged languidly. "Oh, yes, the job was good." "You knew I'd fire you." "See?" The American tempered his indignant glare with a hint of curiosity. "You must love that San Blas girl." "What do you say?" "You must love her, better than your job, at least." "Si, señor, I suppose so." "What is she like, Inocencio?" "Well, she is like other women. All women are alike, only some are fat. One time I had a female from Martinique, and she acted just the same as this one." If she is like all the others, what the devil made you do it?" "Señor, you have plenty of money, and yet one night I saw you bet 2,000 pesos on the rouge. Why did you do that, eh?" "That is altogether different." The Haytian smiled. "I am tired of these females at Colon. They are common people, very common. Then, too, those San Blas people, they are so scared that somebody's going to steal a woman. Maybe if they had left me asleep on shore I would never have noticed no woman at all, but they don't trust me, so sure enough I steal one." "And you say she came willingly?" queried Williams, incredulously. "Oh, yes. When her people commanded her to jump from my schooner, she refused them. I did not understand at the time, but by and by she told me." He swelled his chest with pride. "I guess she never seen so brave a man as me before, eh, señor?" "I guess I never will sabe you niggers," acknowledged the American. Inocencio corrected his recent employer, but without show of the slightest heat. "I am no nigger, señor. I am Haytian. She is San Blas Indian. My father was not even so dark as me. Black men have thick heads, and you have to beat them, but nobody ever beat me, not even a white man. When those niggers sleep, I lie awake and study. I make schemes. That is why I left Haiti." "Do you understand that you've got me into a hell of a fix? I've got to take a trip down there myself to square things." Inocencio lighted a black cigarette and blew the smoke through his nose. Evidently other people's troubles did not concern him. Recognizing the futility of reproach or indignation, the former speaker continued, "But see here, now, this girl, you can't keep her." "Ah, who's going to take her away?" interrogated the Haytian quickly. "Bah! One man tried that, and I killed him with my machete." His thin lips drew back at the memory, and for an instant his yellow face showed a hint of what had made his reputation. "She won't stay with you." "Oh, yes, she will. She was wild, very wild at first, but she will stay." "And how about her people? They're bad hombres. Even the government lets them alone, fortunately for you." They won't make no trouble about that Marquina. He is quite dead, I think." "By Jove, you're a cold-blooded brute." "Señor, you told me once that nobody had ever married a San Blas female, eh?" "Yes, even the old Spaniards tried it, but the blood is clean so far. Something unusual, too, in this country." Inocencio began to laugh silently, as if at a joke. "Some day, maybe, you will see a San Blas half-breed playing in the streets of Colon," said he. "I don't believe it." "I'll bet you my wages, 200 pesos. Come, I'll show you." "You get out of here," said the American roughly. "That's something I don't allow anybody to joke about." And when the mulatto had gone, he continued aloud, "By Heaven, this is sure a tough country for a white man." Inocencio strode through the streets toward the swamp that lies behind the town, oblivious to the grilling midday heat that smote him from above, from the concrete walks beneath, and from the naked walls on every side. It was before the days of the American occupation, and the streets were nothing more than open cesspools, the stench from which offended sorely. Buzzards flapped among the naked children at play in the mire beside the sewer ditches. The place was filled with everything unhealthy, and had long been known as the earth's great festering sore. Neither the Orient nor the farthest tropics boasted another spot like Colon, or Aspinwall, as it had been called, with its steaming, hip-deep streets, and its brilliant flowering graveyards. So hateful had it proved, in fact, that when seamen signed articles binding themselves to work their ships into any corner of the globe, they inserted a clause exempting them from entering Aspinwall. Now, however, the town was lively, for this was the dry season, when the fever was at its lowest, and the resorts were filled with the flotsam and jetsam of a tropic world. It was a polyglot town, moreover, set upon a fever-ridden mangrove isle, serving as one terminus of the world's short cut, and in it had collected all the parasites that live upon the moving herd. The French work of digging had but served to augment the natural population by a no less desperate set from overseas, and now from the open doors of their cubbyholes women of every color greeted the passer-by. Inocencio, whose last exploit was already a thing of gossip, received unusual attention, there being no color line in Colon town. White, yellow, and black women fawned upon him and bade him tarry, but he merely paused to listen or to fan their admiration by a word, then idled onward, pleased at the notice he evoked. Once fairly out of the pest-hole, he threaded his way through the swamp toward the other shore of the island. Blue land crabs scuttled among the mangrove roots at his approach. The place was noisy with the hum of insects. On every hand the heated mud gave forth a sound like the smack of huge, moist lips. But on the other side he came into a different domain. Here the sea breeze banished the hovering miasma. The shore was of powdered coral sand, a litter of huts drowsed beneath a grove of cocoa palms, while a fleet of cayucas lay moored to stakes inside the breakers or bleaching in the sun. Captain Inocencio was a person of some importance here, for besides his occupation as a trader, he exacted toll from a score or more of lazy blacks. They were a lawless crew, gathered from the remotest corners of the Indies, composed of Jamaicans, Bayans, and St. Lucians, all reared to easy life and ripe for such an occasional crafty pilgrimage as Inocencio might devise. They had gathered around him naturally, paying him scant revenue, to be sure, yet offering a certain loyalty that had its uses. Although the village was but a mile from the town itself, Inocencio's word was law. When the Colombian soldiers were called upon to visit the spot, they came in numbers, never singly. The girl was seated on the rickety porch of his cabin, her feet drawn under her, her chin upon her knees. The other women were gossiping loudly, staring at her from a distance, but her black eyes only smoldered sullenly. He swore at the curious negro wenches, and sent the girl about her household duties, then stretched himself in the shade and eyed her complacently until he fell asleep. It was a week later that one of his men came to him breathlessly to announce that the San Blas Indians were in the town. "How many?" queried Inocencio. "4 boatloads." "Did they come to trade?" "Oh, yes, boss." This was no unusual thing, for they often displayed their little cargoes of nuts and fruits and vegetables upon the water front. Inocencio rose lazily and stretched, then, calling the woman, explained the tidings to her. "I will go see them," he announced finally. "Oh, boss," cried the black man, "they will kill you." He shrugged his brawny shoulders and, thrusting the machete beneath his arm, took the trail out through the mangrove swamp. Straight to the Colon waterfront he went, and there flaunted himself before the men from down the coast. Here and there he strolled, casting back their looks of hatred with a bravado that attracted all the idlers in the neighborhood. Wenches nudged one another and tittered nervously, pointing him out and telling anew the story of his daring. Men watched him with wondering admiration, and he heard them murmuring, "Ah, that Inocencio! El diabolo! And so brave! He would fight an army! See the great arms of him, and the eye like a tiger!" It was the keenest pleasure he had ever tasted. As for his enemies, they kept their silence. They bartered their stock, and, having made their purchases, raised sail and scudded away down the coast whence they had come. Inocencio got drunk that night, for who could withstand the lavish flattery that poured from every cantina up and down the length of Bottle Alley? Who could resist the smiles of the chalk-faced females of Cash Street, all eager to laud his bravery? Some time before morning he reeled into his shack beneath the palms to find the woman waiting fearfully. He cursed at her for staring at him so, and fell upon his bed. In the months that followed he seldom lost an opportunity of showing himself to the San Blas men when they came to town, but in time this pleasure palled, as all others had, for the woman's kindred seemed incapable of resentment. Gradually, also, he became accustomed to her presence, and spent much of his time among the women of Cash Street. On one occasion he returned from an orgy of this sort to find her talking to one of his men, a young Barbadian with a giant frame. It was only by accident, due to the liquor in him, that his hand went wild, and he missed killing the fellow. Then he beat the woman unmercifully. Chancing to meet the Señor Williams on the street some time later, he said, "Buenos dias, señor. You see, Captain Inocencio is still alive, and the woman has not run away." His former employer grunted, as if neither phenomenon were worthy of comment. "I've heard how you rub it into those San Blas fellows," Williams remarked. "I can't understand why they never avenged Marquina." "Bah! They have heard of me," said the Haytian boastfully. Then, with a grin, "You remember our bet, señor." "I never made you a bet," the American denied hotly, "but I've a mind to. I've been here 10 years, and I think I know those people." 200 pesos. "You'll never have a child by her. They won't allow it. They'll get her, and you, too, in ample time. I tell you, their blood is clean." 200 pesos that she brings me a San Blas half-breed within 2 months, smiled the mulatto insolently. And Williams exclaimed, "I'll do it. It's worth 200 silver to see a miracle." "Bueno, I'll bring him to you when he comes." Thereafter Inocencio gave over beating the woman. Back at the little settlement beyond the swamp, the coming event did not pass without comment, and although the black women were kind to their straight-haired neighbor, she never made friends with them, nor did she ever accompany Inocencio to town. On the contrary, she seemed obsessed by an ever-present dread, and whenever she heard that her own people were near, she concealed herself and did not appear again until they were gone. Bred into her deepest conscience was the certainty that her tribe would make desperate attempt to preserve its most sacred tradition, and hence, as the days dragged on and her condition became more pronounced, her fears increased likewise. She began to look forward to the birth of the child as the crisis upon which her own life hinged. Inocencio did his best to dissipate her fears, explaining boastfully that the mere mention of his name was ample protection for her, and did he wish it, not even the army of the Republic could take her from him. But still she would not be convinced. And then, in the dark of the December moon, the expected came. It was that season when the rains were at their heaviest, when rust and rot might be felt by the fingers. A gray mold had crept over all things indoors. A myriad of insect pests burdened the air. In the rare intervals between showers, every faintest draught deluged the huts from the dripping palm leaves overhead. From the swamp arose a noxious vapor whenever the sun exposed itself. Tree toads shrilled incessantly. Outside, the surf maintained its sullen murmur. Through the gloom of starless nights its phosphorescent outlines rushed across the reef like phantom serpents in parade. In the dead of a night like this the visitors arrived. Even the heavy animal slumber of the blacks was broken by the scream that issued from the hut of Captain Inocencio, and then the sound of such fighting. The negroes might have rushed to the assistance of their leader had it not been for the echo of that awful woman cry hovering over the village like a shadow. It filled the air and hung there, saturating the breathless night with such unnameable terror that the wakened children began to whimper, and the women buried their heads in the ragged bedding to keep it out. Death was among them, and the bravest cowered, while through the quivering silence there came the sounds of a mighty combat lasting for such an interminable time that the listeners became hysterical. At length they discovered that the night was dead again, save for the sudden patter of raindrops on the thatches when the palm fronds stirred. One of them called shrilly, another answered, but they did not venture forth. Afterward they fancied they had heard the thrust of paddles in the lagoon and strange voices dwindling away to seaward, but they were not sure. Eventually, however, the stillness got upon them more fearfully than the former noises, and they stirred. Then, in time, they heard the voice of Inocencio himself, cursing faintly as if from a great distance. A light showed through the cracks of a hut, and Nicholas, the least timid, emerged with a lantern held on high. He summoned the rest around him, then went toward the black shadow of Inocencio's dwelling, with a score of white-eyed, dusky faces at his shoulder. The door was down, and from the threshold they could see what the front room contained. It was Nicholas who, with clattering teeth and nerveless fingers, dragged a blanket from the bed and covered the woman's figure. It was he who traced the feeble voice to the wreck of a room behind, and strove to lift Inocencio out of the welter in which he lay. But the Haytian blasted him with curses for opening his wounds, so they propped him against the wall by his direction, and bound him about with strips torn from the mattress. Then he called for a cigarette, and its ashes were upon his breast when the French doctor arrived from the hospital on the point. When the white man's work was done, the mulatto addressed him weakly. "Will monsieur do me a great favor?" "Certainly." "Monsieur is acquainted with the American, Señor Williams?" "Oui." "Will monsieur le docteur please to tell him that Captain Inocencio has won his wager?" "I don't understand." "Listen. In the room yonder, under the bed, monsieur will find a little boy baby rolled up in a blanket. The woman heard them at the door, and she was just in time. Oh, she knew they would be coming." The French doctor nodded his comprehension. "But your wife herself," said he. "Perhaps when you are well again you can have your vengeance. The soldiers will—" "Bah! What is the use?" interrupted Inocencio. "The world is full of women." Then, strangely enough, he bared his yellow teeth in a smile of rarest tenderness. "But this boy of mine, they came to kill him, monsieur, and to show that the San Blas blood cannot be crossed. But the woman was too quick of wit. They did not find him, praise God. Le docteur has seen many children, perhaps, but never a child like this." He ran on with a father's tender boastfulness. "Monsieur will note the back and the legs of him, and see he did not even cry, poor little man. Oh, he is like his father for bravery. He will be my vengeance, for he has the San Blas blood in him. He will be a man like me, too. Bring him to me quickly. I must see him again." He was still babbling fondly to the negroes about him when the doctor reappeared, empty-handed. "The child is dead," said the white man simply. In the silence Inocencio rose to a sitting posture. His fierce eyes grew wild with a fright that had never been there until this moment. Then, before they could prevent him, he had gained his feet. He waved them aside and went into the room of death, walking like a strong man. A candle guttering beside the open window betrayed the utter nakedness of the place. With one movement of his great bony hands he ripped the planks of the bed asunder and stared downward. Then he turned to the east and, raising his arms above his head, gave a terrible cry. He began to sway, and even as the doctor leaped to save him, he fell with a crash. It was Nicholas who told the priest that the French doctor would not let them move him, for he lay upon his face at the feet of the San Blas woman, his arms flung outward like the arms of a cross. End of Story 3, Part 2. Story 4 of The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 4, The Wag Lady. Her real name was June. Well, the rest doesn't matter, for no one ever got beyond that point. It was the Scrap Iron Kid who first bore news of her coming to the Wag boys. Knowing him for a poet, they put down his perfervid description as the logical outpouring of a romantic spirit. Reddy summed it up neatly by saying, "The kid has fell for another quilt, that's all." "I ain't fell for no frill," the kid stoutly declared. "I've saw too many to lose me out. This gal's a thoroughbred." "Another recruit for Simons, I suppose," Llewellyn yawned. "I'll drop in at the theater and look her over." "She ain't no actor, either," Scrap Iron declared. "She's going to start a hotel." "Bah, if she's as good looking as you claim, some Swede will marry her before she can buy her dishes." "Sure, they must all pull something like that to start with," said the dummy, who was a woman-hater. "Then, when you've played 'em straight, they h'ist the pirate's flag and go to palmin' percentage checks in some dance hall." But again the idealistic Scrap Iron Kid came stubbornly to the defense of the newcomer. The argument was growing warm when Thomasville and the Swede entered with 2 caddies of tobacco which they had managed to acquire during the confusion at the waterfront, thus ending the discussion. There were 6 of the Wag boys, 6 as bold and unscrupulous gentlemen as the ebb and swirl of the northern gold rush had left stranded beneath the rim of the Arctic, and they had joined forces, drawn as much perhaps by their common calling as by the facilities thus afforded for perfecting any alibis that a long and lonesome winter might render necessary. Nor is it quite correct to state that they were stranded, for it takes more than the buffets of a stormy fate to strand such men as the Dummy and George Llewellyn and the Scrap Iron Kid and their 3 companions. Llewellyn was the gentleman of the outfit, owing to the fact that the polish of an early training had not been utterly dulled by a 4 years' trick at Deer Lodge Penitentiary. The Dummy had gained his name from an admirable self-restraint which no third-degree methods had ever served to break. Thomasville was so called because of a boyish pride in his Georgia birthplace, while Reddy and the Swede—but this is the story of the Wag Lady, and we digress. To begin with, June was young, with a springtime flush in her cheeks and eyes as clear as glacier pools. Yet with all her youth and beauty she possessed a poise that held men at a distance. She also had a certain fearlessness that came, perhaps, from worldly innocence, and was far more effective than the customary brazenness of frontier women. She went ahead with her business, asking neither advice nor assistance, and almost before the Wag boys knew what she was up to, she had leased the P.C. warehouse near their cabin and had carpenters changing it into a bunkhouse. In a week it was open for business. On the second night after, it was full. Then she built a tiny cabin near her hotel and proceeded to keep house for herself, sleeping daytimes and working nights. "Say, she's coinin' money," the Scrap Iron Kid advised his companions some time later. "She's got 50 bunks at $1 apiece, and each one is full of Swede. You ought to drift by in a business hours. It sounds like a sawmill." "If she's getting the money so fast, why don't you grab her, Kid?" inquired Llewellyn. "You cut that out," snapped the former speaker. "There ain't nobody going to grab that dame. I'd croak any guy that made a crack at her, and that goes." Seeing a familiar light smoldering in the Kid's eyes, Llewellyn desisted from further comment, but he made up his mind to become acquainted with June at once. Now, while he succeeded, it was in quite an unexpected manner, for before he had formulated any plan, Thomasville came to him with a proposition that drove all thoughts of women from his mind, and sent them both out to the mines shortly after dark, each provided with a six-shooter and a bandana handkerchief with eye-holes cut in it. Jane had returned to her cabin the following morning and was preparing for bed, when she heard a faltering footstep outside. She glanced down at her money sack filled with the night's receipts of her hotel, then at the fastenings of her door. She knew that law was but a pretense and order a mockery in the camp, but the next instant she slid back the bolt and let in a flood of morning sunlight. There, leaning against her wall, was a tall, dark young man whose head was hanging loosely and rolling from side to side. His hair beneath the gray Stetson was wet, his boots were sodden and muddy. One arm was thrust limply into the front of his coat, as if paralyzed. She saw that the sleeve was caked with blood. Even as she spoke, he sagged forward and slid down at her feet. She was not the sort to run for help, and so, taking him under the armpits, she had him on her bed and his sleeve cut away before he opened his eyes. It was but an instant's work to heat a basin of water, then she fell to bathing the wound. When she drew forth the shreds of cloth that had been taken into the flesh by the bullet, the man's face grew ghastly, and she heard his teeth grind, but he made no other sound. "That hurt, didn't it?" She smiled at him, and he tried to smile back. "How did it happen?" she queried. "Accident." "You have come a long way?" He nodded. "Why didn't you ask for help?" "It wasn't worth while." She looked at him wonderingly, admiring his gameness, then was surprised to hear him say, "So you're June?" "Yes." He closed his eyes and lay still while she poured some brandy for him. Then he said, "Please don't bother. I must be going." "Not till you've eaten something." She laid a soft, cool palm upon his forehead when he endeavored to rise, and he dropped back again, watching her curiously. He had barely finished eating when another footstep sounded outside, and a heavy knock followed. "Hey, June!" called a voice. "Are you up?" It was Jim Devlin, the marshal, and the girl rose, only to stop at the look she saw in the wounded man's face. His dark eyes had widened. Desperation haunted them. "What is it, Mr. Devlin?" she answered. "Have you seen anything of a wounded man within the last half hour?" She flashed another glance at her guest, to find him staring at her defiantly, but there was no appeal in his face. "What in the world do you mean?" "There was a hold-up at Anvil Creek and some shooting. We're pretty sure one of the gang was hit, but he got away. Pete, the waterman, says he saw a sick-looking fella crossing the tundra in this direction. I thought you might have noticed him." Again June's eyes flew back to the pale face of the stranger. He had risen now, and seeing the frank inquiry in her gaze, he shrugged his shoulders and turned his good hand palm upward as if in surrender, whereupon she answered the marshal, "I'm sorry you can't come in, Mr. Devlin, but I'm just going to bed." "Oh, that's all right. I'll take a look through your bunkhouse. Sorry to disturb you." When the footsteps had died away, the stranger moistened his lips and asked, "Why did you do that?" "I don't know. You are brave, and brave men aren't bad. Besides, I couldn't bear to send any person out of God's sunshine into the dark. You see, I don't believe in prisons." When Llewellyn told the other Wag boys of June's part in his escape, his story was met with exclamations that would have pleased her to hear. But the Scrap-Iron Kid broke in to say menacingly, "Look here, George, don't aim to take no advantage of what she done for you when you was hurt, or I'll slip her off." "Aw, rats!" cried Llewellyn furiously. "What do you take me for?" Then, staring coldly at the Kid, he said, "It won't do her any good to have you hanging around either." June's action toward Llewellyn and her mode of life gained the admiration and respect of the Wag boys, and although they avoided her carefully, they watched over her from a distance. Nor was it long before they found a means of serving her, although she did not hear of it for many months. The Dummy came home one night to inform his partners that Sammy Sternberg, who owned the Miner's Rest, was boasting of his conquest of June, whereupon Sammy was notified by Llewellyn, acting as a committee of one, that his lies must cease. Sammy got a little drunk a few nights later and boasted again, with the result that the Scrap-Iron Kid, who was playing blackjack, promptly floored him with a clout of his .45, and the Swede who was standing near by kicked the prostrate Sternberg in the most conspicuous part of his green and purple waistcoat, thereby loosening a rib. It was not long before the sporting element of the camp learned to treat June with the highest courtesy, and since she had been adopted in a measure by the Wag boys, she became known as the Wag Lady. Meanwhile, June was prospering. The homeless men who patronized her place began to entrust their gold sacks to her care. So she went to Harry Hope, the P.C. agent, and bought a safe in which to deposit her lodger's valuables. Frequently thereafter she sat guard all night over considerable sums of money, while the owners snored peacefully in the big back room. When winter closed down, June began to see more and more of Harry Hope, and she began to like him, too, for he was the sort to win women's hearts, being big and boyish and full of merriment. He had spent several years in the Northland, and its winds had blown from him many of the city-born traits, leaving him unaffected, impulsive, and hearty. While the frontier takes away some evil qualities, it also takes some good ones, and Harry Hope was not by any means a saint. As the nights grew longer, he gained the habit of dropping in to talk with June on his way uptown. One evening he paused before leaving and asked, "Can you take care of something for me, June?" "Of course," she answered. He flung a leather wallet into her lap, laughing. "You're the banker for the community, so lock that up overnight, if you please." "Oh," she gasped, "there are thousands of dollars. I'd rather not." "Come, you must. I didn't get it in time to put it in the company safe, and if I carry it around somebody will frisk me." "Where are you going?" "Down to Sternberg's. I'm going to outguess his faro dealer. This is my lucky night, you know." Realizing full well the lawlessness of the camp, June felt a bit nervous as she laid the money away. In the course of the evening, however, she gradually lost her fears. Some time after midnight, when the big front room of the bunkhouse was empty, the outside door opened, emitting a billow of frost out of which emerged two men. They were strangers to June, and when she asked them if they wished the beds, they said no. They backed up to the stove and began staring at their surroundings curiously. It had never been June's practice to forbid any man the comfort of her coal-burner, even though he lacked the price for a bed, but remembering the money in her safe, she sharply ordered these two out. Neither man stirred. They blinked at her in a manner that sent little spasms of nervousness up her spine. "I tell you, it's too late. You can't stay." "That's too bad," said one of them. He crossed toward the desk behind which she sat, at which she softly closed the heavy safe door. It gave out a metallic click, however, which caused the fellow's eyes to gleam. "That safe ain't locked, eh?" he inquired. "Yes, it is," she lied. He smiled as if to put her at her ease, but it was an evil leer and set her heart to pounding violently. She was tempted to cry out and arouse her lodgers, but merely flung back the fellow's glance defiantly. The stranger ran his eye over the place and then said, "I guess we'll set a while." Drawing a chair up beside the door, he motioned to his partner to do the same. They tilted back at their ease, and June fancied they were listening intently. For a half hour, an hour, they sat there, following her every movement, now and then exchanging a word in a tone too low for her to hear. She was well-nigh hysterical with the strain of waiting when she saw both men lower the front legs of their chairs and rise together. The next instant the door swung violently yet noiselessly inward, and a masked man with a gun in his hand leaped out of the night. Another man was at his heels, and they covered her simultaneously. Then a most amazing thing occurred. June's mysterious visitors pounced upon them from behind. There was a brief, breathless struggle, and the next instant all four swept out into the snow amid a tangle of arms and legs. Followed the sounds of a furious scuffle, of heavy blows, curses, and groans, and then a voice. "Beat it now, or we'll croak the two of you, and peddle the word that no rough stuff goes here. Do you get that?" There was the impact of a boot planted against flesh, and the next instant June's deliverers had re-entered and closed the door. One of them was sucking a wound in the fleshy part of his hand where a falling revolver hammer had punched him, but he inquired in a thoroughly businesslike tone, "Got a little hot water, June?" June emerged weakly from behind her desk. "Well, what does it all mean?" "Oh, it's all right. They won't trouble you no more." "They came to rob me, and you knew it?" "Sure. Harry Hope got full and told about leaving $8,000 with you, so we beat him to it." "But why didn't you say so? You frightened me." "We wasn't sure they'd try it, and we didn't like to work you up." "Please, who are you?" "Us? Why, we're Wag boys. Llewellyn's our pal. I'm Charlie Fitzhugh. They call me the Dummy. And this is Thomasville." Thomasville nodded and mumbled greetings without removing his thumb from his mouth, whereupon June began to express her gratitude. But thanks threw the Wag boys into confusion, it seemed, and they quickly bade her an embarrassed good night. Now that they had removed the weight of obligation that had rested upon them, the Wags became more neighborly. Llewellyn and the Scrap Iron Kid called to explain that the Dummy and Thomasville had broken all rules of friendship by hogging the spotlight, and to express their own regret at having been absent during the attempted hold-up. June was eating her midnight lunch when they came, and after they had left, Llewellyn said, "She didn't have any butter, Kid. Notice it?" "Sure. Butter's pillock. Rothstein cornered the supply, and he's holding it for a raise." "Where does he keep it?" "In that big tent back of his store, along with his other stuff." Now the Wag boys did nothing by halves. About dusk the following day the Rothstein watchman was accosted by a stranger who had just muched in from the creek. The two gossiped for a moment, then, as the stranger made off, he slipped and fell, injuring himself so painfully that the watchman was forced to help him down to Kelly's drug store. Upon returning from his labor of charity, the watchman discovered, to his amazement and horror, that during his absence 2 men had entered the tent by means of a 6-foot slit in the rear wall. They had brought a sled with them, moreover, and had made off with about $500 worth of Rothstein Hart's blood, labeled Cold Brook Creamery Extra Fine. The next morning, when June returned to her cabin, she found a case of butter. A few days later the Dummy discovered a string of ptarmigan hanging beside the rear door of a restaurant, and, desiring to offer June some delicate little attention, he returned after dark and removed them. As ptarmigan were selling at $5 a brace, he was careful to protect the girl. He sat on the back steps of the restaurant and picked the birds thoroughly, scattering the feathers with a careless hand. Scarcely a day passed that June did not receive something from the Wags, but of course she never dreamed that her gifts had been stolen. As for her admirers, it was the highest mark of their esteem thus to lay at her feet the choicest fruits of their precarious labors, and although they were common thieves, nay, worse than that, they stole rather from love of excitement than for hope of gain, and the more fantastic the adventure, the more it tickled their distorted fancies. They were most amusing, and June grew to like them immensely. She began to mother them in the way that pleases all women. She ruled them like a family of wayward children, she settled their disputes, and they submitted with subdued, though extravagant, joy. She asked Llewellyn once about that wound in his arm, but he lied fluently, and she believed him, for she was not the kind to credit evil of her friends. Once they had received encouragement, they fairly monopolized her. She was never safe from interruption, for the Wag boys never slept. They came to her cabin singly and collectively at all hours of day or night, during her absence or during her presence, and they never failed to leave something behind them. Roddy was a good cook, but he loathed a stove as he loathed a policeman, yet he donned an apron, and at the cost of much profanity and sweat produced a chocolate cake that would have done credit to a New England housewife. Furthermore, it bore June's name in a beautiful scroll surrounded by a chocolate wreath, and she found it on her bed when she came home one morning. Chancing to express a liking for oysters in the hearing of the Scrap Iron Kid, she mysteriously received a whole case of them when she knew very well that there were none in camp. Of course, she did not dream that in securing them the Kid had put his person in deadly peril. On returning from her duties at another time, she found that during the night the interior walls of her cabin had been painted, and although she did not want them painted, and although the smell gave her a violent headache, she pretended to be overcome with delight. In order to beautify her little nest, Reddy had burgled a store and stolen all the paint there was of the particular shade that pleased his eye. Now, the Wag boys pretended to be carefree and happy as time went on. In reality, they were gnawed by a secret trouble. It was June's growing fondness for Harry Hope. After careful observation, they decided that the P.C. agent would not do at all. He was too wild. He had undeniably lost his head and was gambling heavily, tempted perhaps by the lax morality of the camp and the license of good times. It was the dummy who finally proposed a means of safeguarding June's wandering affections. "Somebody's got to split her away from this Hope," he declared. "It's up to us, and Llewellyn's the only one in her class." The Scrap Iron Kid's face assumed an ugly yellow cast as he inquired quietly, "Do you mean George is to marry her?" "Hardly," exploded the dummy. "Just toll her away." "Why shouldn't I marry her?" Llewellyn demanded. "I can think of 5 reasons," the Kid retorted. He tapped his chest with his finger. "Here's one, and there's the other 4." He pointed to the other Wag boys. "Do you think we'd let you marry her? Huh! I'd sooner marry her myself." Llewellyn ended the discussion by stamping out of the cabin, cursing his partners with violence. Business of the P.C. Company took Harry Hope to Council City in February, so the Wags felt easier, but only for a time. They found that June was grieving for him, and were plunging into deep despair until Scrap Iron came home with the explanation that the lovers had quarreled before parting. It was a signal for a celebration, during which Reddy cooked wildly for a week, making puddings and pies and pastries, most of which were smuggled into June's cabin. Thomasville journeyed out to a certain roadhouse run by a Frenchman, and returned with a case of eggs wrapped up in a woolen comforter. It required the combined perjury of the other Wags to prove an alibi for him, but June had an omelet every morning thereafter. Then, just as they were weaning her away, as they thought, the blow fell. It came with a crushing force that left them dumb and panic-stricken. June took pneumonia. The Scrap Iron Kid brought the first news of her illness, and he blubbered like a baby, while Dummy, the woman-hater, cursed like a man bereft. "How do you know it's pneumonia?" queried Thomasville. "The doc says so. Me and George dropped in with some beefsteaks we copped from the butcher, and found her in bed, coughing like the devil. She couldn't get up, pains in her bosom. We run for Doc Whiting, and, fellers, it's true. George is there now." The Kid swallowed bravely, and 2 tears rolled down his cheeks. The Wag boys broke out of their cabin on the run, then strung out down the snow-banked street toward June's cabin, where they found Dr. Whiting very grave, and Llewellyn with his face blanched and his lips tight drawn. They tiptoed in and stood against the wall in a silent, stricken row, twirling their caps and trying to ease the pain in their throats. The Wag lady was indeed very ill. Her yellow hair was tumbled over her pillow, and she was in great pain, but she smiled at them and made a feeble jest, which broke in her throat, for she was young and all alone and very badly frightened. It was too much for the Scrap Iron Kid, who stumbled out into the freezing night and fought with his misery. He tried to pray, but from long inexperience he fancied he made bad work of it. An hour later they assembled and laid plans to weather the storm. "She's worried about her hotel," Llewellyn announced. "If that was off her mind, she'd have a better chance." "Well, let's manage it for her," the Dummy offered. "I'll watch it to-night." "And who'll watch you?" queried the Kid. "Do you reckon I'd run out on a pal like June?" stormed the Dummy. Whereat Scrap Iron assured him he was positive that he would not, for the very good reason that he and Reddy would take care that no opportunity offered. "You run the joint like you say, and we'll look out her game for her. Then to-morrow night the other 3 can do it. We'll take turns and turn about, and them that's off shift will nurse her. I've been thinking now, if only we knowed something about women folks." "I've been married once or twice, if that's any good," Thomasville ventured to confess, whereupon he was elected head nurse by virtue of his experience, and accordingly they went to work. Dr. Whiting had promised to secure a woman to care for the sick girl, but women were scarce that winter, and he was only partly successful, so the greater portion of the responsibility fell upon the Wags. He also spoke of removing June to the excuse for a hospital, but they would not hear to this, and so the battle for her life began. It was a battle, too, for she grew rapidly worse and soon was delirious, babbling of strange things which tore at the hearts of the Wag boys. Day after day, night after night, she lay, racked and tortured, fighting the brave fight of youth, and through it all the 6 thieves tended her. They were ever at her side, coming and going like the wraiths of her distorted fancy, and while 3 of them divided the day into watches, the other 3 ran the bunkhouse, keeping strict account of every penny taken in. They okayed one another's books, and it would have fared badly indeed with any one of them had he allowed the least discrepancy to appear in his reckoning. It was a strange scene, this sick and friendless girl, mothered by a gang of crooks. When June's condition improved, they rejoiced with a deep ferocity that was pitiful. When it grew worse, they went about hushed and terror-stricken. Through it all she called incessantly for Harry Hope, and it was Llewellyn who finally volunteered to go to Council City and fetch him, an offer that showed the others he was game. But before the weather had settled sufficiently to allow it, Hope came. He arrived one night in a blinding smother which whined down over the treeless wastes, driving men indoors before its fury. Hearing of June's illness, he had taken the trail within an hour, fighting his way for 100 trackless miles through a blizzard that daunted even a Wag boy, and he showed the marks of battle. His face was bitten deeply by the cold, his dogs were dying in the harness, and it was evident that he had not slept for many hours. He whimpered like a child when Llewellyn met him at June's door. Then he heard her wearily babbling his name, as she had done these many, many days, and he went in, kneeling beside her with his frozen breath still caked upon his parka hood. Llewellyn stood by and heard him tenderly calling to the wandering girl, saw the peace that came into her face as something told her he was near. Then the Wag boy, who had once been a gentleman, came forward and gave Hope his hand, and thanked him for his coming. June began to mend after that, and it was not long before Whiting said she might recover if she had proper food. She would, however, need nourishment, milk, but there was only 1 cow in camp, and other sick people, and not sufficient milk to go around. The Wag boys lumped their bankrolls and offered to buy the animal from its owner, but he refused. So they stole the cow and all her fodder. Now, it is no difficult matter to steal a cow, even in a mining camp in the dead of winter, but it is not nearly so easy for a cow to remain stolen under such conditions, and the Wags were hard put to prevent discovery. It would have been far easier, they realized, to steal a 2-story brick house or a printing office, and then, too, not one of them knew how to secure the milk even after they had gained the cow's consent. They made various experiments, however, one of which resulted in Reddy's having the breath rammed out of him, and another causing Thomasville to adopt crutches for a day or so. But eventually June got her milk, a gallon of it daily. Every night or 2 the cow had to be moved. Every day they gagged her to muffle her voice. Then, when discovery was imminent, they made terms of surrender, exacting 25% of the gross output as the consideration for her return. They breathed much easier when the cow was off their hands. Spring was in sight when June became strong enough to take up her duties, and she was surprised to find her hotel running as usual, also a flour sack full of currency beneath her bed, together with a set of books showing her receipts. It was signed by Llewellyn and witnessed by the other Wags. There was no record of disbursements. One day Whiting advised her to get out in the air, and the Scrap Iron Kid volunteered to take her for a dog ride. "I didn't know you had a team," she said. "Who, me? Sure. I got as good a team as ever you see," he declared, and when she accepted his invitation, he proceeded to get his dogs together in a startling manner. He tied a soup bone on a string and walked the back streets. Then, when he beheld a likely-looking husky, he dragged the bone behind him, enticing the animal by degrees to the Wag boy's cabin, where he promptly tied it up. He repeated the performance 7 times. The matter of harness and sled was but a detail, so June enjoyed a ride that put pink roses into her cheeks and gave the Scrap Iron Kid a feeling of pure, exalted joy, such as he had never felt in all his adventurous career. The day she walked over to the Wag house unassisted was one of such wild rejoicing that she was forced to tell them shyly of her own happiness, a happiness so new that as yet she could scarcely credit it. She was to be Mrs. Harry Hope, and asked them to wish her joy. Llewellyn made a speech that evoked the admiration of them all, even to the Kid, who was miserably jealous, and June went home with her heart very warm and tender toward these 6 adventurers who had been so true to her. It was to be expected that Hope would share in his sweetheart's extravagant gladness, for he loved her deeply, with all the force of his big, strong nature, yet he acted strangely as time went on. Now he was sad and worried, again he seemed tortured by a lurking disquietude of spirit. This alarmed the Wag lady, and she set out to find the secret of his trouble. The ice was breaking when he made a clean breast of it, and when he had finished, June felt that her heart was breaking also. It was the commonplace story of a young man tempted beyond his strength. Hope's popularity had made him a host of friends, while his generosity had made No a difficult answer. He had plunged into excesses during the early winter, gambled wildly, not to win, but for the fun of it. He had lost company money, trusting to his ability to make it good from his own pocket when the time came. The time was coming, and his pockets were empty. Spring was here, the first boats would arrive any day, and with them would come the P.C. men to audit his accounts. It was possible to cover it up, to be sure, but he scorned to falsify his books. "I should have stayed in Council City," he said, "but when I heard you were sick—" He buried his brown face in his hands. The girl's lips were white as she asked, "How much is it?" "Nearly 20,000." She shook her head hopelessly. "I haven't nearly that much, Harry, but perhaps they would let us pay off the balance as we are able." "June," he cried, "I wouldn't let you. I'll go to jail first. I suppose you don't want to marry me now that you know." "I love you more than $20,000 worth," she replied. "We'll face it out together." "If only I had time, I could pay it back, and they'd never know, for I have property that will sell once the season opens." "Then you must take time." "I can't. Sternberg will tell." "What has Sternberg to do with it?" "I lost the money in his place. His books will show. He suspects even now, and he's talking about it. He doesn't like me, you know, since he heard of our engagement." The days fled swiftly by. The hills thrust their scarred sides up through the melting snow. The open sea showed black beyond the rim of anchor ice. As nature awoke and blossomed, June faded, and shrank until she was no more than the ghost of her former self. Then one day smoke was reported upon the horizon, and the town became a bedlam, for the door of the frozen north was creaking on its hinges, and just beyond lay the good, glad world of men and things. June could stand it no longer, so she told her sorrow to Llewellyn, who had half guessed it anyhow, and he in turn retold it to his fellow Wags. The Scrap Iron Kid was for killing Hope at once, and argued that it was by far the simplest way out of June's trouble, carrying with it also an agreeable element of retribution. Hope had hurt the Wag lady, therefore the least atonement he could offer was his blood. But Dummy, the foxy old alibi man of the outfit, said, "I've got a better scheme. Hope wants to do the right thing, and June'll make him if she has a chance. The company will get its coin, she'll get her square guy, and nobody'll be hurt, provided he has time to swing himself. The ace in the hole is Sammy Sternberg. He's got the books. Now, what's the answer?" "Steal the books," chorused the Wags, and Dummy smiled. "Why, sure." "You can't stick up no saloon full of roughnecks and sleepers," said Scrap Iron. "Sammy catches his books in the safe when he's off shift, and we can't blow the safe 'cause the joint never closes." But the Dummy only grinned, for this was the sort of job he liked, and then he proceeded to make known his plan. Those were terrible hours for June. She prayed with all the earnestness of her earnest being that her lover might be spared. Repeatedly she strained her tear-filled eyes to the southward. As for Hope, he had tasted the consequences of his guilt, and his face grew lined and haggard with the strain of waiting. He could have met the future with some show of resignation had it not been for the knowledge of his sweetheart's suffering. But as the hours passed, and that thin black line of soot still hung upon the horizon, he thought he would go mad. On the second day a steamer showed, hull down, having wormed her way through the floes, and Nome marched out upon the shore ice in a body. June and Harry went with the others, hand in hand, and the man walked as if he were marching to the gallows. It was not the P.C. steamer, after all. It was the whaler Jeanie. The fleet was in the offing, however, so she reported, and would be in within another 24 hours if the pack kept drifting. Hope ground his teeth and muttered, "Poor little June, I wish it were over for your sake," and she nodded wearily. But as they neared the shore again they heard rumors of strange doings in their absence. There had been a daring daylight hold-up at the Miners' Rest. 6 masked men had taken advantage of the exodus to enter and clean out the place at the point of the gun, and now Sammy Sternberg was poisoning the air with his complaints. Details came flying faster as they trudged up into Front Street, and Doc Whiting paused to say, "That's the nerviest thing yet, huh, Harry? Was anybody hurt?" "No damage done, except to Sammy's feelings." "They surely didn't get much money." "Oh, no. Their total clean-up wasn't $100, but they lugged off Sammy's books." June felt herself falling, and grasped weakly at her lover's arm, for she saw it all. "Come," she said, and dragged him up to her own cabin, then on to the Wag boys' door. They were all there, sprawled about and smoking. "You did this," she said shakingly. "You did it for me." "Did what?" they asked in chorus, looking at her blankly. "Oh, we know," said Harry Hope. "You've given me a chance, and I'll make good." His own voice sounded strange in his ears. There was an instant's awkward pause, and then the Scrap-Iron Kid said simply, "You'd better," and the others nodded. Llewellyn spoke up, saying, "Reddy is our regular chef, but I'd like to have you see me cook a goose." Then he drew from his inside pocket what seemed to be a leaf torn from a ledger, and unfolding it, he struck a match, then lighted it. "I suppose I ought to be a man and face the music," Hope managed to stutter, "but I'm going to cheat the ends of justice for June's sake. I'm much obliged to you." When they had gone off hand in hand, the Scrap-Iron Kid nodded approvingly to George, saying, "That was sure some cooking you did, pal." And Llewellyn answered, "Yeah, I cooked your goose and mine, but she'll be happy anyhow." End of Story 4.